Hello, and welcome to the Sailing and Cruising the East Coast of the United States podcast. I'm Bela Musits.
And I'm Mike Wasserman.
Today's guest on the podcast is Ethan Maass. He runs the CETO operation in the greater Boston region. Ethan had some great suggestions on things that you can do to make sure that you do not need to get towed back to your home port.
Yeah, Bela, this is going to be an interesting interview. And listeners, I think we can kind of listen up and learn for three specific lessons. One is it's best to understand your own situation and contact the appropriate resource to help you. Coast Guard if it's life-threatening or dangerous, and somebody like CETO if it's not dangerous. Second, understand the business model behind these different resources like CETO and make a rational decision on kind of who you want to line yourself up with and who you want to use. It's good to plan ahead on something like this. And then the third thing, which probably most everybody knows except for me, is there's these three levels of calls on the radio. And when do you use which one, I think is really important.
Mike, that was a great summary of some of the key takeaways from my interview with him. So before we get started, I have a question for you, Mike. We've been doing this for a while now. And what's the single most important recommendation that we've made for people wanting to get into sailing or to improve their sailing skills?
Bela, I think that's an easy question, and that is acquire the knowledge and skills that you need to be safe and prepared out on the water.
Exactly. And given our backgrounds as university professors, we know a little something about education and learning. And there are two important elements in learning to sail. First is learning all of the knowledge sailors should understand, like rules of the road, navigation, principles of sailing, safety, and weather. Second is turning this knowledge into skills you will use on the boat, like docking, anchoring, motoring, and sailing the boat from destination A to destination B.
Agreed, Bela. And in fact, you and I are pleased that this episode is sponsored by Nautic Ed, which is short for Nautical Education. This is an established company with a really cool online platform for learning the knowledge elements of sailing at your convenience, along with a network of experienced sailing instructors for the hands-on skill development elements that are on the boat.
Right you are, Mike. Nautical Education has a wide spectrum of sail training modules, from navigation rules to offshore sailing to bareboat chartering. By taking Nautical Education sail training modules, you can get your international sailing license and credentials. These skills are important if you are just starting out in sailing, want to improve your sailing abilities, or are gearing up for a bigger sailing adventure. So listeners, to check out Nautic Ed, click on the link in the show notes, and as a bonus, you will receive your first 2 lessons for free. Now that's a great deal. So let's get right to today's interview. Ethan, welcome to the podcast. So nice to see you.
Thank you. Nice to see you too.
Great. So Ethan, you're a captain with CETO, and CETO is one of the largest sort of services that when boaters break down or have a problem can call. So tell me a little bit about yourself, but before we get into that question, let me ask you this. If you're at a social event and at that social event you meet someone for the first time, and after you meet them they say to you, "Oh, very nice to meet you, Ethan. What do you do?" How do you answer that question?
Well, I explain to people what we do on the water, that CETO is similar to AAA. It's a boat towing company, or similar to a tow truck company, but out on the ocean.
Yeah, that's a clear and succinct answer. Very good. So talk to me a little bit about some of the things that you actually do, because I think it's a lot more involved than just come tow me back to my dock.
Oh, absolutely. People like to say that we've probably seen it all on the ocean or on the water, and that's pretty true. But a lot of it is pretty routine. What you would expect is boats are mechanical things that break, like cars on the highway. And if you think of all the thousands of cars which break down on the highways around the world every year, there's not as many boats in the world, but a similar ratio, if not more, boats break down because of the harsh environment that the boats operate in, saltwater environment. So we are providing service to those boaters on the water when they need help.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's say I break down on, let's do a simple one. I run out of fuel. And for me on a sailboat, that means there's also no wind. So it's nice and calm out there and I run out of fuel. So I think of getting on 16 and sort of what my instinct wants me to do is call the Coast Guard. So is that what I should do? Or take me through what I as a boater should do in that sort of a non-emergency sort of simple scenario?
Sure. Well, you mentioned being out of fuel, which is probably our number one call for assistance on the out on the water within within CETO at least. And when people need help on the water for something like being out of fuel, you would consider that you could think that it's not that big a deal or not a big emergency. And in most cases, it's not a big emergency. You might feel that it is, because you can't get home, not like on a road on the side of the car on the side of the highway that you can walk to the nearest gas station. You can't do that with a boat. So people do need to decide whether they're in any immediate danger. And that's one of the first questions that we ask people. And if they're not, they're out of fuel or the engine stopped and they are able to anchor, they're in a safe spot and they have life jackets for everybody on board. And it's not an emergency situation, and they're going to reach out to somebody to help them on the water. And in this case, it might be CETO. And they can call on channel 16. And that's important to be able to communicate on the radio if you are in trouble. But a lot of our calls, the vast majority of our calls come over the phone. It's discreet. It's one-on-one. You're just talking to CETO. We're going to help troubleshoot on the phone a little bit. And then we'll send a boat to assist you. And then in your out of fuel scenario, we're going to try giving you fuel first to get you home. And if not, we'll tow you. But out of fuel is absolutely the biggest, largest number of calls for assistance that we get.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let me ask you this question. Let's say that happened to me and I called the Coast Guard. Would they end up referring me to you, or how does that work?
Yeah, so there's a lot of cases. It used to happen a lot more, not as much these days, where our services have become very prevalent. But people still from time to time call the Coast Guard for help, and the Coast Guard has a whole set of questions they ask to determine whether somebody is in distress or not in distress. And it's a set of criteria that the Coast Guard applies to each situation. And if they decide that the situation falls below the threshold of distress, then they refer the boater to not necessarily just a towing service, but anybody who's willing to help. And they do what's called a marine assistance request broadcast, saying there's a boat broken down in this location. Anybody willing to help can proceed to that location or come up on the radio and say we're heading there. And in a lot of cases, we'll respond to those calls and see if the boater wants our help.
Got it. Okay. So what sort of, how far offshore can I be and still call you guys?
Sure, absolutely. That's a good question. And we get, it's a very common question that we get, particularly at boat shows when we're standing at the boat show, trying to explain our services to people. But people ask, how far will you go? And I turn the tides a little bit usually when someone asks me that question. I say, well, what kind of boat do you have? Because a lot of people, they want to hear some amazing story about how far offshore we went, but when they have a 19-foot runabout or something like that can't necessarily go 50 or 100 miles offshore, right? I say, well, how big a boat do you have? And they tell me what size boat. It's a 15-foot Boston whaler. Well, we're going to be able to come get you as far as you can take that boat. But we do go offshore quite a bit. And it's not a hard and fast limit. It's as far as we can safely go, based on a number of factors. The fuel on the CETO boat, the weather conditions is a big factor. The size of the boat that's calling for assistance, because if it's really big, we can't tow it as far with the amount of fuel we carry. And then how far, the endurance of the captain as well, because our captains are limited to 12 hours of runtime underway in a 24-hour period. So if a big sport fishing boat calls us from 150 miles out, we're going to have to try to figure out how to address that situation. But people who are very far offshore we will often work with somebody else to get them brought in closer to even. Sometimes that's the Coast Guard.
Got it. That makes sense. Now, do you also provide any medical assistance? Let's say, you know, I broke my arm, and there's plenty of crew on the boat. We're okay. You know, a broken arm is not a life-threatening medical emergency. Is that something you guys get involved in, or not really?
It is something that we would respond. We're out on the water on patrol anyway, so we would see if we can help or assist in any way. But we are not emergency responders, so we don't, and we're not emergency medical technicians or paramedics. We have basic first aid equipment on our boats. But if we're in the right position to assist somebody in a real dire emergency, absolutely, we would respond.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. So, what are some of the? We talked about running out of fuel. What other things can you help me with?
Sure. So, if you can imagine, if you can dream up a scenario on the water where somebody got in trouble, we've responded to it at some point in time, and sometimes it's a buoy caught or a line caught in somebody's propeller, or it's out of oil for a two-stroke engine, or boats aground under certain circumstances. We'll be able to help pull them back into deeper water. We've responded to fires, medical emergencies, like you said, boats taking on water. I could go on, and we've seen it at one point in time. We've seen a thing or two.
Yeah.
But it just comes down to what kind of assistance we can provide, and we'll try to do whatever we can to provide assistance.
Yes. Now, do all CETO is up and down? What part of the United States does CETO sort of cover?
CETO is international, but
okay.
we do, obviously, our boats or our franchises are located in areas that are populous with boats. So all the boating hotspots on the East Coast, for the most part, will have a CETO franchise. But we provide coverage nationwide, international. So if somebody broke down somewhere where there wasn't a CETO, we would arrange, they could still call us, and we would try to arrange assistance locally,
right,
and provide some reimbursement for that.
Got it. Now, is there like a CETO policy that I can buy and sign up for? How does the sort of the financial transaction work?
Sure, absolutely. We sell a membership. That's why I mentioned AAA early on. Similar to how AAA provides coverage on the highway, a CETO membership purchased on an annual basis provides coverage to boaters for the routine breakdowns on the water. A tow home, a jump start, pulling you off the sandbar if you meet the criteria for what we call a covered ungrounding, water all around you, that sort of thing. A boat smashing on the rocks or sinking or on fire is a whole different ballgame, which wouldn't be covered under the CETO membership. But that's a determination that's made on scene with the CETO captain and the people on the boat. But that annual membership is available online. And again, I say AAA a lot because most car owners have AAA. A lot of them do. And with us being in boating areas, we go around and try to educate boaters about having a membership with something like CETO.
Right. Now, for example, like my insurance policy that I have for my boat, and I have a 45-foot sailboat, so pretty good sized vessel. That comes with a towing coverage and stuff. Is it still worth my while to get like a separate CETO policy on top of that?
Well, we certainly think that it's important to have a membership with a towing company, in addition to or separate from any insurance coverage. And there's several different reasons why we believe that. One is priority service. So CTO members come to the front of the line all the time with the CTO franchise. And that means that if it's busy, or we get two calls for assistance at the same time, one from a CTO member and one from somebody who has coverage from some insurance policy, the CTO member comes first. And that's a guarantee that we make to our members to get priority service before anybody else. And we won't say no to somebody who's asking for a tow and is willing to pay for it. But in those insurance situations where they have coverage on their insurance, we're going to charge the customer for the tow at the end of the tow, and then the customer would submit for reimbursement for their insurance from their insurance company. So there's a couple other different reasons. I'll just quickly.
Yes.
Some insurance policies have limitations on the coverage, so that reimbursement for towing, separate from the insurance policy for accidents and that sort of thing, may have stipulations on dollars per hour, the length of the tow, the total dollar amount, or even the location. Some insurance companies on that coverage say we will only take you to the nearest safe port, not necessarily the nearest place that can repair your boat.
Got it. Got it. So if I have a membership in CTO, what's the financial transaction then if I need your services?
If you're a member, then there's no other financial transaction. You've already bought a membership for the year. We verify that your membership is valid and that it matches the boat you're on matches what's on the membership, and we come and get you. And if it's within the criteria of what's covered on the membership and whatnot, we're going to tow you someplace to get repaired. In most cases, it's I go back to that question of what kind of boat are you on. In most cases, we're towing you back to where you started from, to your home port. People start asking about long distance and that sort of thing, but the reality is they're taking their 30-foot boat out fishing, and then they're going back, and somewhere along that line they break down. I know with sailboats like yours, people are going to range a little bit wider and further away. And we, for instance, assisted a sailboat just a few days ago that had caught a line in its propeller, and they were from far away, and they weren't asking for a tow all the way back home. They just wanted help with the line in their prop, which we were able to help them out with.
Right. So that's a great example, because one of the things that, particularly sailing around New England with all the lobster pots, that I worry about, is that something that you guys will go underwater and help cut off and untangle, or sort of where do you draw that line?
Sure, that's situation dependent. The CTO membership covers disentanglements that we can perform from the surface, and sometimes it's just a matter of towing a boat around in a certain way, or grabbing the lobster pot line that's in their propeller from an angle that the boater couldn't do from on board their own boat. That's what happened the other day. We were able to grab the line from a few feet away, which the customer couldn't do, and we were able to free them. But then if it requires somebody going in the water, or a diver, that sort of thing, the CTO membership doesn't provide coverage for that, but we're going to work out an arrangement with the customer to get a diver on scene, and charge a fee for that, but a nominal fee. We charge reasonably. But a lot of cases, we assist the customer, free them from the entanglement, and tow them somewhere safe. And then once they're in calmer water, they either go in the water themselves or they find another diver locally. But we can always help provide with those services.
Yes. Yeah. Got it. Okay. That makes sense. Now you mentioned CTO is a franchise. So there's most franchises have a certain geographic area that they cover. What if, like, I'm on Narragansett Bay, and I think I've seen a lot of towboat US boats, but I'm not sure I've seen any CTO boats. So are those sort of like you guys do different territories? Are there overlaps? And if I have one, let's say I have CETO, but there's no CETO around Narragansett Bay, will Boats US help me, or how does that work?
So in most boating markets, where there's a concentration of boating population, you're going to find both of the major towing services, CETO and Towboat US. In Narragansett Bay, CETO absolutely is in operation, and I think they run 5 boats out of Portsmouth. But they also keep boats at some other marinas around Narragansett Bay, and they provide coverage all of Narragansett Bay, the whole state of Rhode Island, Block Island, and all of those waters. Which company you see more than the other has mostly to do with where you go with your boat.
Right.
And the provider for Towboat US in Rhode Island is they're out of Wickford on the other side of the bay, and that's just where you've gone is what boats you see. But if you're in an area of the country where there is no CETO franchise, then you need assistance, you can still contact our 800 number, and we will try to find somebody who's local, competent, and insured towing provider who can come and help you, and then we would provide reimbursement for that service. On the East Coast, there are not very many places that are not covered by a CETO franchise. But it's always possible to find a place where there isn't one. There is no official reciprocity between the companies, but from time to time, I would say both companies refer work to the other one here and there. It's like I said, nothing on an official basis, but sometimes it just makes more sense to the customer to have somebody who can get there quickly, take care of somebody.
Right. So I think one of the things I just learned from what you said is that if I'm summoning CETO, if I'm calling CETO on channel 16 and I don't get a reply, then I should try calling the phone number, because that'll take me to some other central location, and then they can determine whether there's a CETO franchise that's in the geographic area I'm in, and if not, then they will find somebody to come get me.
Exactly. Yeah,
perfect.
And I mentioned earlier about calling on the phone. Sometimes it's hard to sort through a situation like that over the radio, even if there is a local CETO office that you're talking to on the VHF. But even a call over the radio to CETO, we're going to very quickly try to get that person to contact us on the phone so that we can get more detailed information about what the situation is. And just talking about VHF radios for a second, for people watching this, the cell phone is great, and that's how we like to talk to customers. But a VHF radio is an essential piece of safety equipment, because if you're just broken down and you're not in any immediate danger, it's fine to place a phone call and be speaking to one person on the other end of the phone. But if you're in have a real dire emergency going on, you want to get on channel 16 and broadcast that to anybody who's around, because there might be a boat very close to you who could render assistance very quickly.
Right. And if I believe, you can correct me on this, you probably know better than me, if you make a Mayday call, meaning you're in danger, life danger, then fundamentally people are obligated to come sort of help you.
So the law of the sea definitely says that every boater is obligated to render assistance in some capacity. The type of assistance is what's not stipulated. And sometimes just going to somebody who's in danger, checking on them, and staying with them until a more capable responder arrives is enough. But yes, exactly. There is an obligation to provide assistance, but that doesn't necessarily mean towing them all the way home or taking them off their boat or whatever it is. Doing something that you feel is unsafe, you should always be within your capabilities of what you and your boat are able to do.
Right. So you should, I hope you know the answer to these questions. So can you take us through sort of let's say I'm on my boat. Can you take us through the difference between, a Mayday call and a pan call and a Securite call?
Yeah. So it's 3 levels of broadcasts on the radio. Mayday being immediate threat to life, and it's your typical emergency call to get attention of as many people as possible. And that saying that on the radio will get the attention of a lot of people. So if you need help immediately, then that's the way to go. A pon-pon is an urgent message, which doesn't necessarily indicate immediate risk to life. So if you have a developing situation that could turn into a life-threatening situation, it might warrant a pon-pon. The Coast Guard uses pon-pon for what they call an urgent marine information broadcast, saying something really urgent is happening here, and we're putting a broadcast out about it for people to know. But it doesn't rise to the level of a mayday. And then the security call, or sécurité in French, is just a general safety broadcast, which could be something like, I found an obstruction, a log floating in the water, and I want people to know about it. Or where you most hear them is where commercial vessels or ships coming around a corner in a harbor, they can't see very far, and they want to make a broadcast that in case there's somebody coming the other way, to make passing arrangements. And that would be the sécurité call.
Right. Very good. Thank you for doing that. I think our listeners will appreciate that. So let me ask you a question, Ethan. How does one become a CETO captain?
Sure, that's a good question. That's at the cocktail hour, or whenever, when people are asking me about what CETO does, that's one of the next questions that comes up. How did I get into it? And I'd say that lots of people who work on the water have come from all kinds of different backgrounds, or taken different paths to get there. But within the CETO network, there's a lot of people who were prior Coast Guard. I was in the Coast Guard, or grew up on the water, or just sort of stumbled into it. In this area, there's a lot of people who start working for CETO as a retirement job, and they've boated their whole lives, ended up getting their captain's license based on their sea time on their own boats, and then want to put that license to work. And all of our captains are federally licensed by the U.S. Coast Guard, and have all kinds of regulatory compliance that we need to meet as a captain and within the business to follow all the rules and regulations. But like I said, I was in the Coast Guard. I grew up sailing, got involved in emergency medical stuff, then was in the Coast Guard. And when I was a kid, I saw the CETO boats working on the bays of Long Island, New York, and I don't know if I knew it at the time, but I must have been destined for it, because I ended up here in Massachusetts and started working for CETO here in Boston. It's 21 years later, so here I am.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. So most of the times when I've seen CETO boats or boats, U.S. boats out, it looks like they have a crew of one. Is that typical, or does that sort of depend upon the size of the boat and stuff?
It's typical that most of the assistance towing vessels across our industry of any company are going to be operated with a single person. That's not the rule, it's just the norm. And we would, in my operation, I would put a second person on a boat if the situation required it, whether it was a little farther offshore, or bad sea conditions, or the size of the boat. Sometimes if you're towing a larger boat, you're going to need to have two people, a deckhand on the boat, or another captain.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's say I came to you and said, "Hey, Ethan, I'd like to get a job with CETO, and I meet your qualifications." Is there like a training program that you put people through, or an apprenticeship program? I don't know what the right way to characterize it is.
Yeah, sure. And we get calls like that all the time. People asking to come be a deckhand for us, to work towards their license, their Coast Guard license, or to learn how to be a CETO captain. And we don't have, it's different. Every CETO franchise is going to have a slightly different program for that, about how they train people. But I think typically we're looking for, when we're hiring, we're looking for people who are already great boat handlers. And then we're going to teach the technical aspect of towing boats. We don't, in my operation, I don't hire deckhands or have people come on in an apprenticeship capacity. It would be nice if we could, but for the amount of time that we spend waiting for a call to come in, it's hard to coordinate to have somebody, a trainee, in the right place at the right time to actually go do some of the tows that we do.
Right. Yes. So we've been chatting here for about a half hour, so I want to start wrapping this up. Is there any question that I haven't asked you that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, I think you mentioned you used the example of running out of fuel, and that definitely is probably our number one call for assistance. But some of the other things that we see happening out on the water, I'd like to mention real quick, is things like dead batteries, where somebody shut their engine off and anchored at the sandbar for a while, or in your case, sailed for a number of hours and then went to start the engine, and the batteries weren't strong enough to start the engine. So we do a lot of jump starts on the water. Some of the things you can do to address those two issues is, as far as running out of fuel, is have a better fuel plan, which involves putting an amount of fuel in your boat based on the usage, instead of relying on something like a fuel gauge. And in the case of a fuel gauge, they can stick in one position and the needle doesn't go down, or the fuel gauge could just not be working. And I've long advocated that people try to calculate or come up with an idea of how much fuel their boat uses, and then put in the proper amount from however much they used the boat the previous time, or just fuel up enough at the beginning of the day to know that you're going to have enough fuel to get home. You could follow the 1/3 rule, where you're using a third of your fuel to get where you're going, a third of your fuel to get back, and then having a third in reserve. Sailboats, I've found, out of fuel is a pretty common call, because if they're sailing long distance and the wind isn't strong enough, they end up running the engine and sort of motor sailing overnight when they're coming from Maine down to something like the Cape Cod Canal in our area, and then run out just shy of getting there. But making sure you have enough fuel to get where you're going is very important. On the battery front, fully charged batteries, making sure the battery connections are clean and tight. I tell people, if you can wiggle the wires on your battery at all, it's not tight enough. Those two things, having clean and tight battery connections, sometimes can prevent you from needing a jump start altogether. But I think those two things are probably the most common calls. Having a maintenance plan, knowing how often you need to change certain things on your engine is important. But I think those are the common calls. And then obviously we have an unspecified mechanical failure is pretty common for the calls that we get on the water, and just making sure your boat is well maintained and not letting things go too long before replacing parts. I like to use I don't have a name for the rule, but if you have two of a certain item on a boat and one of them fails, you replace both of them, not just one of them. It's for instance, on a twin engine boat, and you have something fail on one engine, replace that same item on the other engine.
Right. Those are some great tips. And I'm glad you brought up the fuel thing, even on a sailboat, because when I bought my boat, the fuel tank gauge said full. And I said, oh, isn't that nice? The previous owner filled up the tank. And so I thought nothing of it. And then after sailing around, after using the boat for like a month, and not that I used the engine a lot, but I used it some, I noticed it still said full. I said, that doesn't sound right. Well, sure enough, the fuel gauge was broke. And I do keep a fuel log. So every time I run the engine, I write down the engine hours, and I know the last time I fueled it, and I know I use about 0.6 gallons an hour on my engine. So I run that calculation all the time. And I think that's something that relying on that fuel gauge can get you in trouble if you're not careful.
Sure.
So that was a great tip. I had one more question I was going to ask you. What was it? I wanted to say that, so I did use Ceto once. So I did a charter down in Tampa, sailboat charter with my son and my daughter-in-law. The three of us went out and we were out in the Gulf of Mexico, not very far out, and maybe a mile or two. And we were sailing around. It was great. And the wind died. I said, okay, we'll just motor back to the marina. And I go to turn the engine on, dead. Right? Nothing. And so I call up the charter company. They said, okay, we'll send out Ceto. And it was Ceto. And I'm pretty sure. And they came out and the person got there like within an hour and towed us back. And they did such a great job. I mean, they knew what they were doing. And, they had that confidence as soon as they pulled up and said hello. And it towed us right back to the dock and, towed us on a line. And then they did a hip tow, I think, as it's called. Right. And then maneuvered us right into the slip. And I was like, wow, that was amazing. So my experience was very good.
It's funny that you that you mentioned that, because we get that kind of comment all the time when we're maneuvering someone else's boat into a tight spot and back into their own slip or wherever. In any profession, when you do something enough, you get good at it, and we tow boats. That's what we do. So we get comments like, wow, Ceto, you put our boat back into our slip better than we can do ourselves, even when it's just one boat.
Exactly. Exactly.
The technical on-water maneuvering stuff that we get to do a lot is kind of the fun part of the job. And I hear that from my guys who work for me. They say, wow, I get to do so many cool things on boats that I never thought I would get to do. But it's we get to go do the things that nobody else gets to do on their boats, and we do it over and over again. So we get pretty good at it.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, Ethan, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast. This was very informative. I learned a lot. It was very helpful. So I appreciate you being a guest on the show.
Sure, Bela. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
So Bela, really interesting interview. That was pretty cool to bring in somebody like this and talk to them about what they do every day and the advice they had for sailors. What were your big takeaways?
So my first thing I'm doing when I get back to the boat is I'm checking my starter battery. So that was, to me, the big tip, right? Being able to start your engine is important, even on a sailboat. And as I mentioned in the podcast, in my conversation with Ethan, that once we got towed back, went on a charter because the boat wouldn't start after the wind died. So first thing I'm checking is my starter battery. I think a couple of other takeaways for me, it's usually the simple stuff. And it's overlooked. You have to have sufficient fuel. And the other important thing is not just sufficient fuel, but on boats, fuel often gets contaminated with water. And there's a lot of fuel filters on boats, particularly on a diesel engine. There's like 3 different levels of fuel filters on my diesel engine. And so what happens is, fuel gets, when you have a tank that's half full of fuel on a cool, humid day, you'll get condensation inside the tank. And then that water falls to the bottom of the tank. And there's filters along the way to take all that stuff out so you don't damage your engine. But people don't think of changing their filters. And what happens is these filters get plugged up. And the other thing happens if you're out on a day that's pretty wavy, the fuel kind of gets stirred up, and all of the sediment on the bottom of the tank, which normally sits on the bottom of the tank, and now sort of gets stirred up. When you have 4, 5, 6 foot waves, the boat's moving up and down pretty good. So the fuel gets stirred up and the sediment gets all integrated into the fuel, and your fuel filter gets plugged, and so your engine stops. So that's a big thing that I worry about as a sailor. So you got to clean your fuel filters, and that's really important. I think the other thing that's important is I come from a lake sailing background. In my early days, I sailed on lakes, and on a lake, almost everything is marked, every shallow spot, because there's no charts. There are no marine charts for lakes. So what they do is they mark everything with a buoy or a danger buoy, and you get used to that. And then if you go out into like Narragansett Bay, for example, or any body of water where there's charts, not everything is marked. So there's a lot of shallow areas that if you're not looking at your chart, you don't know about. So you got to pay attention, and you got to have your GPS or your charts or whatever. You got to know where you're at, because otherwise you run the danger of running aground. And the third thing that I think is important is you got to have a working radio. It's just really important. You can't rely on a cell phone. I've seen cell phones get wet and they stop working. Sometimes, I mean, I think on Narragansett Bay, every place in the bay, I have a pretty strong cell signal. But if I start heading offshore a little bit, the cell signal fades pretty quickly. So it's important to have a working radio. So to me, those are sort of the three big important things that I take away from that.
Interesting. And I liked the conversation with Ethan about how sometimes it's appropriate to use the radio, and then sometimes it's appropriate to use the phone, the cell phone, and know when the right situation is, right? When other people need to be aware, or it's, life-threatening or emergency, that's when you use the radio. And if it's just kind of okay, I need help with this thing or this thing, right, that isn't a danger to yourself or other people, that's when it's best to have a private phone call. So I thought it was cool that it's best to have both tools and know when the right time to use the right tool is, but when in doubt, use the radio, right? That was kind of the takeaway there.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Mike. The way that I think about it is, if there's any situation where I need help, even if I'm out of gas or out of fuel, or I can't start my engine, the first call I'm going to do is on the radio, because everybody can hear that. And when you're on the water, everyone's supposed to be monitoring channel 16, which is sort of the hailing channel. Mm-hmm. So everybody can hear that. And then if somebody replies to me, so if CTO comes on and says, "Hey, we hear you," then you can always switch to a cell phone call for a more detailed conversation. Right? Yeah. So not everyone needs to listen to that. And it's just easier to talk on a cell phone than a radio. Yep. But I like to make that first call on the radio so that everyone in the region can hear it. And if someone happens to be able to be close by and they can come over and just hang out next to you to make sure you don't get into trouble, people are very helpful and very friendly on the water. So that's the way I sort of think about it.
Yeah. Okay. So go over it with me again. So you have an emergency, you assess the emergency. What are the levels, and what do you do?
Okay. So a real emergency is a mayday. Mm-hmm. And that says, hey, dangerous, life in danger. And you say mayday, that's going to get everyone's attention, everyone who's listening to that radio.
And that would be like a fire, you're drifting in towards something and you can't control the boat at all, right? So on and so forth. Or there's somebody is in a dire emergency situation, right? Those types of things.
Right. Like someone is injured or has a medical emergency, or your boat. I mean, a fire on a boat is like a really bad thing, because you can't run very far. Mm-hmm. Or you're drifting towards the rocks. And so that potential life is in danger. So that's a mayday. That gets everyone's attention. And as we discussed in the podcast with Ethan, mariners, there's an obligation to help in a mayday, because it may take the Coast Guard a half hour to get there. And I may be 5 minutes away. So that's a mayday. And then there's a pan. A pan says, hey, I ran out of fuel, and I just want to let people know that I'm drifting here in the middle of Narragansett Bay, so I can't get out of your way.
Yep, makes sense. You're not an immediate threat to something, but it could be.
I need help. But I'm not in any danger. Okay. And then the other one is securite. And securite says, oftentimes I hear that on the bay, or I hear it out on the water where there's a big ship coming and they're on a blind corner. So they'll say, hey, the car carrier so-and-so is coming up underneath the Newport Bridge and we're inbound, blah, blah, blah. So it's just kind of letting people know this is what's going on. Or I think the example we gave in the podcast was there's a log floating in the
debris.
water.
Yep.
There's some debris and hey,
Avoid
securite,
Yep.
there's a log floating here. And oftentimes when there's things like that, like a log floating or debris or something like that, the Coast Guard will get on and they'll reply to you and say, hey, where is that? Give us your GPS coordinates. And oftentimes there's Marine police, right? Or harbor patrol or sea tow. Sometimes those people will respond and mark it or take care of it. Right. So there's a lot of resources on the water that oftentimes we're not aware of, and that's another good reason to do if you're in danger, to do the Mayday on the radio. Don't call the Coast Guard on the phone because you broadcast that and there can be harbor police, harbor master, sea tow can be close by and they can come help, right? Because those folks are trained in those types of things.
Cool. So radio first, have a phone. It's important to have both tools and use them both at the right time, right? Radio first, phone second, once you've established some contact and you've assessed the situation. Cool. Last thing, my thought on my side, learning a little more about this company. I mean, we've talked about these companies a little bit over the years, right? And I kind of know a little bit about them, but it's interesting from a business model standpoint. It's a franchise. They're these owner operators, often, as you said, former Coast Guard service people, and everybody's a licensed ship captain and all these things. From the customer facing side, it's a subscription model first, right? They do a la carte pricing essentially, but they really push the subscription model. This was really interesting to me from my perspective as a business professor. Any thoughts from your side, as both from your business professor days and from your boat owner days? Does this model work? Is it effective? Anything particularly interesting about it to you?
The model seems to be very effective. There's two big companies in this space. There's Sea Tow and Towboats US. So those are the two big gorillas in the room, so to speak. And I think they cover most of the United States, and many of them overlap. They have redundant coverage in areas. And I have one of these towing contracts, policies, if you will. And, so it's pretty darn cheap. I think I pay like just under $200 a year. And
wow. Yeah,
that's their platinum policy. And, if I run out of gas or I can't start, they'll tow me back to my home port.
Yeah. If you use that one time in 5 years, it's paid for itself, right?
Oh, way paid for itself. Right.
Interesting.
So I think it's a business model that makes sense. I think the economics for boat owners, it makes a lot of sense as well. Right. It's a great, and they'll come and, the policy covers more than just getting towed. And these guys will come help you do all sorts of things. So I think it's kind of neat. And I think here again, you and I often marvel at all the various different ways there are to make a living. And, this is like something the average person doesn't even think about. Oh, I drive a sea tow boat for a living, and I go out
an owner operator.
Yeah, I'm an owner operator, and I tow people back. So I just think it's really great.
Yeah, me too. Well, great. What do you think? Time to wrap this up?
Yeah, sounds good to me, Mike.
Great. Well, listeners, thanks for joining us for yet another episode. We hope you found the conversation with Ethan Maass interesting and thought-provoking. And as always, if you have questions about what we've discussed, please get in touch with us. Our email is sailingtheeast, that's all one word, @gmail.com.
Yeah, we really appreciate your feedback. And if you like the podcast, hit that follow button on your podcasting application. Hey, and also help spread the word about the podcast. Leave us a review. If you know of someone that would be a good guest, let us know. We'll try to get them on the show. Hope to see you out there on the water. So until next time, signing off from upstate New York. See you all soon.
Sounds great, Bela. And from over here in Münster, Germany, auf Wiedersehen.
Okay, sehr gut.
Okay.